What's going on, my friends? This is Dave Wood, and I wanted to bring you a message today that's going to be predominantly targeted at parents, and this isn't related to really business, but it is in certain regards because I think that family is important to business, and if your family's not doing well or something like that in one regard, then your business is going to do less well. And so, but this does have a lot to do, I think, with treating people correctly, and also understanding that modern society has some made up diseases. Okay. So here's what happened. I was talking to one of my friends that has a kid, a very close friend of mine. And this kid has some struggles with attention and struggles, paying attention in school and whatnot. And he has those struggles because of course his father has those struggles. And he kind of inherited it through that line. And my friend has had a little bit of a difficult time understanding some of it, and I was talking to him about it. But one thing that we both agreed on that was really simple, that was really basic level agreements is that modern society wants all people to be the same, right? So today in the modern world, it's like we don't have like village, titles and stuff like that. Like there's not like a gate warrior and like a chief and things like this. We have job titles. It's actually quite a different kind of society where people actually in today's society, we know lots more people and we're way more disconnected from all of them, right? So we actually have less relationships, even though we know more people. We have less knowledge, even though we know more things. We have less of a lot and more of a lot of other stuff. And really the reality is that society is greatly imbalanced. One of the things that society does a really bad job of, in my opinion, is I don't think society raises children properly as a whole. Really, I don't think society does that good of a job with it. And you can evidence, you say, what would be the evidence of that? The evidence would be the way that crime seems to, over a period of 10 to 20 years, always go up. Increases in murders and robberies and all sorts of stuff like this. And this really comes from not raising children properly, right? It's actually a very simple problem to fix. If you raise children properly when they're young, when they're older, they don't run into these problems. And so what's this got to do with kids having ADD, the title of this video? I wanted to do a quick video because I grew up my entire life struggling with attention. And there's still tendencies in my brain, even still, that I've got to fight out. And I used to do all sorts of things to cope with that. And it was very frustrating. It caused me some major self-esteem issues over the years, before I changed, because I always saw that other people could pay attention. And for some reason, I always struggled paying attention to everything that I was doing. So, for example, I had a very easy time paying attention if what I was doing was very exciting, which I think everybody can pay attention to exciting things, can they not? Like a movie or something like that. I mean, nobody, a kid doesn't have a problem paying attention to a movie. But when it comes to something like really tedious, boring work that I don't like to do, I had a really difficult time paying attention growing up. So I know a lot about what it's like growing up in a very, very, very ADHD mind. And the reality is that there's a lot of beautiful things about it, and there's a lot of very frustrating things about it. And I think that a lot of times people don't understand their kids, and like usually a kid doesn't really start developing issues from it until, I don't know, it seemed to me it was like around the time I was like maybe 10, 12, something like that, where it's like everybody's always telling me to pay attention and I don't even know what they're talking about. I'm like, well, I'm paying attention, but I really wasn't paying attention. And so what happened is that I missed a lot of important information growing up because I never really learned to pay attention at a young age. You say, well, why didn't you? You were raised in a good family. Well, even though I was raised in a good family, I think that people were less aware of when I was growing up because, we didn't have the internet and stuff like that when I was a newborn, when I was a really young kid. And so there wasn't a lot of the methodologies, the technologies, the herbological medicines, and all the stuff that we actually have very freely available to us today. So what I told my friend is this is what I said just on the first call. And this is something that I'm going to tell you too. Don't ever, for any reason, put your kids on any sort of prescribed amphetamine, no matter what the reason is. It's extremely bad for the brain. It causes micro lesions all over the brain that are permanent brain damage. Kids drop dead of heart attacks from that medication. all through, every year you have kids dropping dead from Ritalin medication in particular, and other forms of prescribed amphetamines. And all it does to a kid's brain is it makes their brain addicted to the medicine. So then after, a certain period of time, they're paying attention about as good on the medicine as they used to before they took it. And now if they get off of it, they have a problem and their brain is permanently damaged. That's literally all that it does. It's completely unnecessary. It doesn't solve the problem, which is actually why I'm making this video. So you say, well, what's actually the problem with kids who really struggle with paying attention? The problem I would describe as cognitive dissonance, or basically clunked up neural processes that are kind of cross-firing and they don't really know how to work together in the right way. So the kid doesn't really know how to pay attention. And the reason they don't know how to pay attention is because they were never really trained how to pay attention, because they grew up unconsciously paying attention to other things than what most people pay attention to. It's not that they can't pay attention, is that they pay attention to things that you're not paying attention to, and you pay attention to things that they're not paying attention to. They're probably not very good at paying attention, for example, to detail. And this could cause a big problem, because if your brain doesn't learn how to pay attention to detail at a very young age, then what happens is that your brain is used to not looking at detail and not working. And then what happens is that the lack of work that your brain is doing makes it so you don't actually notice detail all through your life. And when you don't notice the detail that you want in your life, then what happens is you forget things. You don't remember names. You don't remember appointments that you're going to. You don't remember what your homework assignments are. And there's all sorts of things that can be a major pain in the butt for a parent who's got a kid that's struggling with ADHD. And so what's the easy society fix for it? Make them like everybody else, give them a pill, shut them up, right? This is really, really, really bad for kids. Number one thing it does is you're labeling a kid with a disorder when their brain doesn't actually even have a disorder. This is just made up modern nonsense. If somebody had something like this 200 years ago, they would just get a different kind of work that was more involved in probably movement, or more involved with the way that they use space with their body and mind. And actually 200 years ago, a lot less people had problems with this than people have today. And that actually says something about modern society. I know there's a lot of my friends that have talked about things like this, and a lot of people, if they don't learn to pay attention, what do? They start coping in one way or the other as they get older, because they never actually learned the core cognitive skills that enable somebody to pay attention to detail, which are actually very simple for the brain to learn, especially at a very young age. So if you actually refocus, you say, what's the actual problem? The problem is the way that the brain connects and represents information. It's missing some sort of part in it, right? And the brain has to learn how to kind of boot itself up and pay attention with a lot of force, okay? The brain has to learn how to do that in somebody that's like this. So you say, well, how would you do something like that? How would you boot the brain up? Well, let me explain. A person who's not very ADD, or let's say a person is just good at detail naturally. Usually a person that is good at detail naturally, they don't really particularly need their brain booted up to pay attention to detail. Their brain will pay attention to detail better if their brain is booted up. And by booted up, I mean warmed up. So without a warmed up brain, somebody with attention deficit disorder is going to have a very difficult time paying attention to detail. And that's because their brain is not kind of like, their engine needs to be revved for a little while before they drive the car, because they have a different kind of engine in the brain. And actually the engine that they've got in the brain is it's an engine that sometimes moves a lot faster. It's sometimes got a lot more horsepower, right? It sometimes is a lot more intelligent than the other kind of the brain, but it's missing the functional ability to pull information together in a way that is cohesive and in a way that interacts properly with their memory. And this is because their brain has gotten used to being very lazy, right? And not paying attention to detail because it's frustrating. And so because they don't pay attention to it, their brain never learns to pay attention to it. Then they avoid the detail all their life. And because they avoid the detail and they don't pay attention to the detail like what they're supposed to do, right? Then all of a sudden these patterns start manifesting all over their life, because they're just not paying attention to detail. And you say, well, how do you get a kid to pay attention to detail whose brain has a very, very difficult time focusing? Regimented daily behaviors that are very specific in very intensely exercising the cognitive functions of the brain will do it for somebody really at any age, but it'll particularly do it well for kids, particularly, between the ages of like 5 and 10. They'll be a little bit more easy for them because their brain has grown a lot more then. It'd be easier a little bit before then. Like if you start these patterns with like kids that are very, 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 very small, they're going to have a lot less problems than any of us had as adults the rest of their life. And then they'll end up being smarter than all of us. So you say, well, what are some things that you could do to teach a kid to pay attention to detail and teach their brain to work hard? Because this is actually the problem. The problem is their brain is not working hard. Their brain is being lazy. And a lazy brain is a lazy brain because the lazy brain has been trained that it's okay to be lazy in some manner or another. And maybe a parent is not doing that on purpose. But a parent's not teaching their kid to be lazy, but the kid doesn't know how to make their brain, go into a normal schedule of work. And one of the reasons is, of course, they're kids and they like to play and all this stuff. But another reason is because their brains are built very differently than our brains, right? So what can you do with a kid? First thing you could do, okay, is they need, in my opinion, an ADD kid, I think, needs a minimum of a 1 hour warm-up routine with their brain in the morning. You say, that's a lot of warm-up routine. I mean, do I have to sit there with them? You might have to sit there with them and make sure they do it until they know that there's no escaping it whatsoever. And it should be a permanent pattern that goes on even when they're not in school their entire life. 6 days a week minimum, but really they're welcome to do this whenever they want. It's their warm-up routine. It's just part of their habits, right? So minimum of 6 days a week, they do this warm-up routine, and then maybe they do something else the next day, like paint or something like that in the morning. The goal of the exercises in the morning is to overload the brain as much as possible with as an intense cognitive work. Cognitive work would be like doing math, doing writing, doing music, you know what I mean? Playing brain games, things like this. You want to warm up the brain with as much cognitive work as you could possibly do in an hour. Think about it like you're going to the gym and you're lifting weights with your brain. This is actually more what it's like. You're like lifting weights with the brain, right? And so you're like, well, give me some examples of that. Very simply, let me give you some simple examples, okay? Because I think the simple examples are actually quite valuable. The simple examples would be getting a math app, a gamified math training app, adaptive math, okay? It could go over very simple. It could go over, for example, multiplication tables. And the kid is allowed to do nothing for 30 minutes, but solve one math problem after another, as many as he possibly can, as fast as they possibly can. And they have to get that section right before proceeding to the next problem. Math is the most important they can do. In my opinion, it's going to be the most effective thing that they can do with all the various different personalities out there to really boot the brain into gear, okay? So that's very easy. You could actually do math for the full hour, and while they're doing the math, do something like listen to music with them, or listen to some kind of personal development that's going to give them value for all their life. Like, for example, get them listening to personal development audios from people like Brian Tracy or people like Eric Worre or people that are experts in like Zig Ziglar and stuff like this, like people that are thought experts, and you have them listen to the personal development while they're doing the math. So their brain is getting information that's going to be useful for them being able to make money their whole life. But this intense work that they're doing with their brain is going to start teaching their brain how to work hard. And, it actually is not a good idea, not a bad idea for somebody that has very strong ADD or something like that to do math for 1 to 2 hours a day for 6 months to 2 years. Because the math by itself, it'll teach their brain how to pay attention to micro detail. And because they're doing very intense micro detail over and over and over and over and over again, and they have to do it even if they don't like it. This is the key. They got to learn to sit there and to do something they don't like to do without any medicines, right? And it's not a matter of whether it's math or whether it's writing or whatever it is. You see, some kids like to write. And so then that might be a problematic exercise because then they just go and they write stories and they never learn to pay attention to detail, which is not the purpose of the boot up session. The purpose of the boot up session is to put a huge amount of quantum energy into the front side of the brain, the frontal lobes of the brain, boot them, and to fill them with connections. And because what happens is the more that you do that, the more work becomes more easy for your brain. So again, this should be a permanent schedule for them, a minimum of 6 days a week for their entire childhood, right? You say, why permanent? The reason it should be permanent is because their brain is always going to need to be booted every day if they're like that. There's no escaping it. This is the way that their brain is wired. However, over a period of 2 years, the neural networks will form that just it'll start enabling them to do tons of work with the brain. And they're not going to need caffeine. They're not going to need ADD medicine, which is horrible for the brain. Caffeine is actually much better for the brain than that stuff. They're not going to need any of it. So because they don't need it, right? Because their brain just boots, it's going to be actually hard after a period of time from very simple exercises for somebody to even say a kid has a disorder. Right? So first of all, right, the brain needs to learn to work. And the work will help the brain start learning to pay attention. Now, attention is going to come from learning how to stay operating in the visual system all through the day. Usually people that are very ADD are very emotional, which is they're very heart-centered people like myself. And I've noticed this a lot. They're very kinesthetic type people. But the majority of data that exists in the universe is visual, right? So if you can't really clearly utilize visual data in your imagination, then what happens is a lot of times that's because your brain doesn't know how to work hard enough in order to be able to do that, and you need to learn how to train the brain with visual imagery. The only problem with trying to train a kid with visual imagery is there's not really got a lot of good programs to do it, and an ADD kid might get distracted and then they just wander off and then they're not doing what they're supposed to do. The best kind of training for this for kids is actually memory training, because the memory training gives them feedback when they don't do a visualization properly. The association never links and they don't remember it. So they know that they did it wrong because they don't remember it, right? So memory training would be, there's lots of memory training apps that are out there that do mnemonics, for example, the visual memory training apps. They're very good. And so you could get a math app, you could get a memory app and stuff like that. But the point is the math goes first because the math will boot the consciousness into work mode faster than anything. And then you do visual manipulation of images with your imagination, for example. But that's, again, it's not the easiest thing to train a kid who's used to running all over the place, right? So the intense work on the frontal lobes of the brain, getting the brain to work 10 times harder in an hour that normally works all day, that's the goal, right? It's like you go to the gym, you're lifting all the weights you could possibly lift, and you're like, and then you put it down, and then you feel good all day long. Well, in the brain feel good, your brain releases all these neurochemicals that, for example, will make a lot of issues with depression go away. And it'll also teach people how to pay attention to what's going on outside of them. Okay, it'll teach the kids how to pay attention to what's going on outside of them, because they're very good at paying attention to what's going on inside their heart and their mind and their feelings, but they might not be so good at paying attention to what's going on in the outside world. So the very intense visual imagination manipulation, okay, combined with mathematics, your goal is to overload the brain so it's just overwhelmed. So what's the actual problem, for example, with so the way somebody's consciousness operates in ADD? A few things. Let me explain it. Number one, the brain is used to being lazy because it's not actually looking at details. So, for example, a person that remembers things very well, they really focus all their attention on the micro detail, for example, in people's expressions. ADD people generally don't do this. They generally look at the space. So there's people that look at the detail and there's people that look at the space. People that look at the detail tend to remember things. People look at the space, they tend to just avoid the detail because their brain finds it difficult, because their brain isn't used to being booted up and getting into work mode. So if you teach the brain to boot up and get into work mode, then you teach the brain how to then pay attention to the detail, how to look at the lines between things, right? How to trace everything with your eyes, like you trace your eyes around the lines of things, right? Cognitive exercise, like you're paying attention to the detail, to the lines, to the shapes. And this teaches the brain how to organize visual imagery around the detail, which is the way that memory actually works in the visual imagination of the brain. The next thing is that you got work, you've got visual imagery problems, and the next thing is that you've got disconnected representational systems. So a representational system would be, for example, feeling, right? This is one representational system, feeling. You'd have taste, another representational. I got to taste some water here. Okay, so The representational system, you'd have feelings. Okay, you'd have taste, you'd have sight, right? These are all different systems. When those systems aren't all linked together, when you create, when you're understanding something, you don't remember what's going on. You say, what do you mean? Okay. When I'm talking, turn every word into its own visual image. Start there. So as you're listening, try to make bright three-dimensional images of every single thing that I say, right? For example, thing. I was thinking about thing 1 and thing 2, old Dr. Seuss book, and imagine what they look like, right? When I say right, I'm thinking about a right arm, right? So you train your brain by paying attention and by turning everything into visual images. What happens is over a period of time, you train your brain to connect incoming data to something that your brain is actively doing with the imagination. Then that behavior later becomes unconscious and you just do it automatically. Well, if you do that automatically because you did it when you were young, this is what a lot of kids do and a lot of other kids don't do, right? What happens is that it trains your brain that incoming data needs to be also created as its own representation inside the unconscious and inside the conscious minds. And then you actually remember what's going on. So for example, if you turn everything that comes at you into visual images, okay, and your brain keeps doing that and creates symbolic images for every single thing that you hear or that you say, all of a sudden your speech is linked with images, your incoming data is linked with images, and this fixates 1,000,000 times better in the brain than if you don't do it that way. So just the fact of active imagining, it's an act of work in the brain that people don't know how to do. But really, the brain just needs to learn to work in an ADD kid. It's not a matter of they can pay attention fine. Their brain doesn't know how to do the work is the actual problem. It's actually not an attention problem. It's a work problem. And the math makes them do large amounts of work with their brain in a very short chunk of time. Language learning also would help with this, for example. But there's nothing like math. I'm telling you, there's nothing like math. Because you got to do an intense amount of work with the brain that you don't like to do. You got to regiment it. Then eventually they'll just get used to doing it. It'll become a permanent part of their habit and a permanent part of their day because they grew up doing it. Because they'll do the math in the morning, and then because their brain is booted up into work mode, they then can pay attention all through the day on their own without any need for medication that's destroying their heart and brain. I just read an article where, there's a Ritalin heart attacks warning thing, where just this article about 51 people dying or whatever of just Ritalin, just giving them heart attacks. And there's other people that have strokes and, all sorts of stuff. And people make excuses about it. And they're like, well, people die in society anyways. I've heard all the excuses that companies make. Look, if a kid dies of a Ritalin or of Concerta, one kid matters. You know what I mean? One child matters. Think about if that was your son. Think about if that was your daughter, right? And the reality is it's very, 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 very unsafe for the brain. It's safe in the sense where they have a lot of scientific testing that shows over a long period of time that it generally works for what they're doing. And generally people don't drop dead. So that's what they'll quote at you. And they'll quote all sorts of excused behavior for giving your kids amphetamines because a good parent can't just sit there with them and then figure out how to find a way in order to get them to pay attention. If my dad would have had tools to help me pay attention at a very young age like I have, I would have never had attention issues my entire life. He would have solved it by the time I was 7 years old, right? My dad at the time when I was a kid didn't have the tools to be able to train my brain to do that because he didn't understand it because he didn't have this issue. Of course, I grew up with the issue and now I have solved it. Because I've solved it, I know how to solve it in others. I'm very good at paying attention to detail now. I'm not perfect because I've not been doing it my whole life. But like my ability to pay attention now is better, it's literally better no matter what's going on. It's 5 times better than when I used to take, for a while, I took ADHD medicines. And my attention is 5-10 times better than it was when I was on those medicines without being on them. And the reason is because I actually trained my brain over a period of time how to get its butt in gear. Okay, does that make sense? I trained my brain over a period of time how to get its butt in gear and to work. And if you train your brain to work, and then you train your behavior to work, now all of a sudden you've got a working model to fix the actual problem, which is a work problem in the brain. That's actually the problem. I'm telling you, it's not an actual problem with attention. Is just something that can be trained. It can be ameliorated, or whatever the word is. It can be strengthened by exercise. Russian scientists have proven this to a very great degree. The attention can be infinitely improved, basically. Right? There's limitations on visual attention because there's a limited set of nerve cells that, for example, create visual imagery and stuff like that in the brain. However, the attention can just be improved and improved and improved and improved and improved and improved. Asked a Buddhist. So if the attention can be improved and trained, why are we telling kids they have a disorder? They actually don't have a disorder. This is a problem with modern society. There's no disorders in children that are like that. There's some other disorders, like, for example, if somebody had was mentally retarded or something like that. That would be, I would say, more of a disorder. But people that have attention deficit disorder just don't know how to work with their brain. And the worst thing you can do as a parent to teach a kid to work with their brain is give them an easy cop-out for something that's difficult for them. Because that's not what life does. Life doesn't give you an easy cop-out, right? Life doesn't give you an easy way out of your problems. Life makes you generally solve problems, right? Or you wind up in a bad situation. And so it's really important to understand that you're teaching the people that do this, the others, they're teaching their kids to do something that is against their principles because they don't know how to solve it, or because the doctor says it's okay, or because the doctor wants to prescribe every kid that has any kind of issue ever in school. They want to give them street drugs is essentially what they're doing. They're essentially injecting them with crystal meth. That's, if you think about it like that, then all of a sudden you're mad, right? And you're like, well, that's not what they told me, right? And they're not thinking like that either. They're just trying to get rid of the problem. They think the ADD is something that could just be swept under a rug and then just put the rug over the top of it, and then the rug's there, so the dirt's no longer there. The problem's solved. Actually, no, the problem's not solved. The ADD is still there. This is the problem. If you want to solve a problem with a kid, teach them to pay attention, and this actually solves the problem. And you can do this through cognitive exercise. There's studies on this that have proven this. But the best kind of cognitive exercise is just a pattern that happens every day in math. Now, there's also some nutrition stuff that's important. An ADD person, for example, might need more protein. They're going to need more omega fats. So if you do something like fish oil or Udo's oil, if they're vegetarian diet's fine as well. The brain needs to produce lots of omega-3 fats because they got a lot of brain energy. So you need Udo's oil, omega fats. Another thing that might help them is, for example, something like curcumin. Curcumin can be a way to calm them down, for example, curcumin with pepperin. So this is like a turmeric extract, but it's not turmeric, it's the extract, the strong stuff. But it doesn't activate if there's not pepper in it. So if you can't find one with pepper in, then you just grind up some pepper tablets and one of these things, and you put it in their food or whatever, or you have them take it in the morning as a supplement. And then all of a sudden, that'll help keep a kid calm. And what it's not going to do, it's not going to give them the easy fix to the brain where they can just instantly do, for example, what somebody that doesn't have those parts of their brain not working right does, which is just like those kids just pay attention, right? And so they got to actually learn to pay attention. But if you teach them to boot their brain in the morning through personal development and through lots of intense cognitive exercise, right? A booted brain will stay in performance mode at like 10 levels higher than an unbooted brain all of the day. This is actually a good habit for adults as well. But a lot of people, they don't need it because they just wake up ready to work. My brain actually isn't like that, right? My brain requires a lot of personal development to get into gear. A lot, right? And I used to compensate for that with tons of caffeine. And then I used to compensate with that with, I went and got some prescribed ADD medicine. And I believe that destroyed a lot of my personality. You know what I mean? And there's evidence of that I can see in my old videos and stuff. I can tell when I'm not on it, and I can tell when I'm on it in my old videos. And I think a lot of the spiritual energy gets disconnected from the prescribed amphetamines, because that's all that it is. It's just prescribed amphetamines. I justified it by looking around on the internet and then finding out that finding out that, some people said there's nothing wrong with it. But then I looked at the people as well that had their kids dying and stuff like that, which is real serious. I was like, well, I'm not a kid, I'm an adult, right? So I did it. And the reason I did it was because I was first using caffeine because I needed something to boot my attention. And the caffeine actually worked quite well. I think it would have been much harder for me to succeed, for example, in the first place if I didn't, at the time, if I didn't use caffeine because my brain couldn't pay attention very well. And so, for example, I had no way of booting the brain. My brain was just kind of lazy all day. So then all of a sudden I put some caffeine in my system and my brain could work. So it was like a gift from heaven to me. I'd never been able to pay attention. I'd never been able to work like that ever in my life. Like I literally didn't have the ability to do it. And then what happened was because I was utilizing caffeine to control my attention, well, eventually the power of the caffeine wore off and I just needed more and more. And then what happened is that didn't work. And so rather than, again, solving the problem and figuring out how to actually just solve the problem now, which is very easy to do, what did I do? I went and I got something else that was prescribed that was stronger. Well, where does that end? It just ends with something stronger and something stronger and something stronger. If you don't solve the problem that they've got, this is just going to continue on. And it's not a problem in the sense there's nothing wrong with them. They just have never learned properly how to use their brain to do what they want their brain to do. They've never learned it, right? So if they learn how to use their brain for what they want their brain to do, right, it's not going to be easy for them at first because they got to understand that it's not okay to stop work just because it's not fun. That's got to be trained out of kids at a very young age. Like, no, you can't just stop doing work because it's not fun. Sit there and finish what you're doing. We got 30 minutes left. And then they're doing something that's very, 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 very intense, right? That boots the brain up. Then the brain is different all day. And over a period of 6 months to 2 years, these exercises that I'm giving you will build new neural connections, right? And I haven't given you them in order or anything like that. I might go write a blog post about it at some point or another in the future. But like, you're basically giving them a tool, which is a morning routine that can stay with them all their life, that gives them tons of value, that then gets their brain into gear to where all of a sudden, because their brain is woken up, they don't even need a cup of coffee. They don't even need caffeine, and they can literally just pay attention from the morning until the evening. They can pay as much attention as they've ever wanted to pay, right? They could join as much as they've ever wanted to join now. No, I'm just joking, right? Because their brain knows how to do it. Okay, the math and the visual energy will solve this problem. Now, music will also help. The other thing that's very important with ADD kids in particular is if they're having a lot of hyperactivity problems, they need some sort of intense morning routine of exercise for like 20 minutes or something like that. Where like for 20 minutes, they just are supposed to dance and do squats and do push-ups and everything that they do. But the routine is so important to kids like that. The reason is because their brain doesn't naturally have routine. And so when a routine comes from outside themselves and they say, nope, this is your routine as long as you're in the house. It's going to stay your routine until you're 18 years old. You're welcome to change the routine if you want to change it when you're 18. Now, all of a sudden, though, you've got a kid that does math, for example, for 30 minutes a day on a gamified math app. Now, what's that going to do for their school? Well, all of a sudden, when they get to math class, they're like, I can solve all these problems in my head, right? Like, it's the easiest thing in the world for them to do because they've trained their brain and their biology and their frontal lobes to get into work mode right when they wake up, right in the morning. Their brain gets booted up, maybe with exercise first, then the math or something. That's a good order, right? Their brain is booted up and it's ready to work. Right? So they've just trained themselves. I'm in work mode. It doesn't matter if I'm in the mood for it or not. It doesn't matter if somebody else wants me to or not. I've got to work. It's the morning. That's a good habit for a kid to have his whole life, right? A pill is not going to do that because, like, let me give you an example. What happens if that kid wants to stop taking the pill and then they just don't take it anymore behind your back or something like that because they think it's destroying their personality, which it is. They've got a bad feeling about it 100% of the time. Kids do. Kids hate that stuff when they first start taking it. They're like, then they just kind of get sucked into this thing because it helps them get all this attention. But then they stop being themselves, and it really messes up for example, it could spurt their growth, all sorts. It can interrupt their growth process. It can interrupt all sorts of things. So now all of a sudden, though, what do you got? Now you've got a routine, and then they should also have some kind of an evening routine that's more involved with intense visualization, right? So morning routine could be whatever, evening routine more oriented around visualization. You can also do math in the evening, but now you've got something to where this person is going to get better and 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 better at math their whole life, which actually math makes you better at everything. Literally, math makes you better at everything you do, right? Math is one of the most important functions in the brain. So now all of a sudden they have the ability to pay attention to accounting, and they have the ability to pay attention to money, and they have the ability to pay attention to the fine line of detail because their brain wakes up and it works, right? And then they go into actual work, which is much easier than the work they already did with their brain. It's much easier work to just sit there in a class and solve 5 math problems than it is to solve problem after problem after problem after problem, as many as you can in 30 minutes. Right? And there's a million apps, and they're free, that do it. The other things that would work, brain training apps. And the other thing is, if somebody's struggling with paying attention to what people are saying, the easiest way to fix that kind of attention, I think I got to go here in a minute. The easiest way to solve that kind of attention that people have is to do transcription work. So math and transcription work, for example, turning all what you're hearing in. Transcription work is going to do this. You say, what would transcription work do for me? Transcription work gets you listening to something that's incoming information, and then you're having outgoing activity that links the brain incoming to outgoing, which is the listening process in the brain, is what actions your brain is taking automatically with information that's coming in. So this will link into your neurology, right? After a period of doing it for 6 months or something like that, it would link into your neurology that you listen to something and your brain needs to repeat it, for example. That needs to be drilled into somebody's brain by habit. And if somebody doesn't naturally do it, if they naturally don't repeat things, then what happens is they just start forgetting information. So transcription work will actually solve somebody's listening skills. Really, it would solve it better than most listening training, because the person's brain starts doing automatically what other people are training them to do, which is to just repeat what other people are saying and listen more. So transcription work is miraculous. So transcription work, mathematics training, visual imagery, and it's got to be a disciplined thing where you say, from now on, we can do it together, but no matter if you don't want to do it or not, you have to do this in the morning. And if they cry, they cry. They'll stop crying in a couple of weeks. They'll be thankful in a year, because all of a sudden they'll start noticing how much better their brain is at everything than everybody around them, because they learn to work right in the morning. And it's not bad if a kid gets obsessed with doing mathematics, for example. This is not bad for them. Anyways, I got to go. I got somebody that's trying to talk to me on Facebook, so I got to get going. Hope this helped.